Welcome back to part 2 of my Mazda Tribute engine removal. If you haven't seen the first part, please check out my other videos and you can see the first section of this. That's about all we can do under the car for now, so let's turn our attention to the front struts and front hubs and let's see if we can get those disconnected so that we can lower this engine down. It's just a matter now of removing this wheel. Now this will need to be done on both sides of the car. I'm only going to show it once because it's just a repeat procedure. So here's the rest of that drip tray and splash guard coming out of the way. Now the bolts securing the hub to the suspension strut can be removed. What I'm aiming to do here is to leave all the hub connected, all the CV shaft connected, and as much connected as possible. Just want to remove the hub from the shock tower so that it can be lowered down. Just giving that a wiggle here just loosens those bolts and we're able to pull them out of the way. Also just here is the sensor for the ABS. Now I undid this one. This one was a little stubborn and it really didn't want to come out. They are just a tight fit in there. Once the bolt's out, there's no reason that that should be sticking in there at all. Refrain from hitting it with a hammer or anything like that. It just needs to be wiggled and it eventually will pull through. It's just accumulation of dirt and rust around that hub that's just made that difficult to come out. You can see here that this one really did not want to move, but with a little bit of force in the right way and eventually that sensor came out. You don't particularly want to break those sensors, they're just expensive to replace and there's nothing wrong with it, it's just a little bit stuck in its groove. You'll also need to remove the link pin that's just linking the torsion rod to that suspension strut. Again, that's just one bolt, and I'll just remove the one at the top because it's much easier than getting the one at the bottom. Lastly, I just removed the two bolts securing the brake caliper to the hub assembly, and then I just slide the brake caliper and pads and all off the disc. Notice I have one nut just securing the disc onto the hub just so that that doesn't fall off, and I also secure the caliper with a piece of wire or string just so it's not putting any strain on that brake hose at all. You can see now that the hub and that whole assembly is free from the suspension strut. Moving now inside the car, this is where the steering shaft goes in through the firewall. We need to disconnect this from the top of the steering rack. There are 4 bolts here that need to be undone that cover this rubber boot. From memory they are a 10mm bolt, and also being inside the car, it's the first lot of bolts I've had that don't seem to be rusted up or covered with dirt, so that was a nice change. You will also need to remove that footrest. I don't know how this looks on the left-hand drive models, but this is a right-hand drive model because we're in Australia, and this is how it looks under here on my particular model. Then you'll be able to lift up this rubber cover, and I just slid it up the shaft a little bit just to get access to the pinch bolt that secures the steering shaft down to the top of the steering rack. I had the steering wheels at this point, I had the front steering wheels at this point in the straight ahead position just to make it easier to put back together, and I also marked it just so that I can put it back together the same way. It just makes it easier to avoid any sort of 180-degree movements of the steering wheel. Notice also it is a very special nut and bolt that hold this, so that it's not interchangeable just with the other nuts and bolts, and it was also Loctited on as well. With that bolt removed, that shaft will be able to slide out once we lower the steering rack through the bottom of the engine. Also at this point here we can begin to get the rubber boot and just peel it up off those 4 bolts that stick through the firewall. Just peel it off. It will be fairly tight against the firewall because it's been bolted up there for the last 10 or 15 years, and it does make a tight seal. But once you peel it up off the firewall, you can begin to poke it through into the engine bay. Back under the front of the car here, I'm just putting a little bit of movement onto the serpentine belt tensioner, just so I can remove that belt. And I want to remove the air conditioning compressor. I decided to leave the system fully gassed and not to remove the gas out of the system, just to save a little bit of work on the other end. It's just a matter of undoing the belt. There's a few bolts here. Be aware that the compressor is quite weighty, and you can see here it did actually fall a little bit. I didn't have it supported. Make sure you do support it so there's not extra weight onto those air conditioner lines. Whilst underneath the front of the car here, I've just got a jack, and I want to jack up the engine just a little bit, just to support some of the weight of the engine. Notice that I'm using some blocks of wood so that there's not too much pressure directly on the sump, which could possibly crack it. Now the right hand front engine mount here, I want to loosen, because I'm going to use that mounting point to fix a chain just to support the engine when I lower it down. With this mounting point removed, be aware that you do not want to be getting underneath this engine anymore, because it does have the potential to fall down upon you. So at this point it's very much safety first, and make sure that you're not climbing back underneath that engine at all, or putting any parts of your body underneath that engine, because at the moment it's balancing on a jack and a couple of engine mounts only. With some of the weight taken off the engine mounts, I was able to loosen the bracket for the engine mount here and begin to install a lifting chain. I run a lifting chain from the large studs from the right-handed engine mount bracket, and I put it over to some large bolts on the left-hand engine mount that sits on the transmission. I find that this makes a nice point to lift the engine from. Now unfortunately I haven't got it shown here, but as soon as I bolted this up, I did hook this up to my engine crane and then supported the weight of the engine, and I was able to remove that jack from out from underneath the bottom of the car. With the engine being fully supported by the engine crane, I'm now undoing the two bolts that hold this cross member here to the front of the body. Be aware that once these bolts come undone, that the engine may move a little bit and possibly fall down just a fraction. Make sure that the engine crane is supporting the weight of the engine at this point. With the engine crane fully supporting the weight of the engine, it's now time to start to do some of the other undo some of the other bolts that are supporting the subframe to the body of the car. These bolts are quite long. There's two of these, one on either side. I'm also undoing the transmission mount where that attaches to the body, and you can see every time that these mounts come undone that the engine weight does pull down a little bit more on that engine crane. So make sure that that engine crane is fully supporting the engine weight. These are the last two bolts that you'll have to do. There's this one and the mirror image on the other side. Be aware that once these start to get undone, there's nothing else holding the engine in place. So as I'm undoing this, I can feel the weight of the engine is pulling against the bolt. If this is the case, you may want to tighten it up a little bit more with the engine crane. You really want to get it to a point that you can wind this nut off with your fingers without any of the weight acting upon it. At this stage, it's also very important just to make sure that you've got all those plugs and wires and everything else, as you don't want to damage anything as the engine begins to move down. Should be able to see here that I can start to undo this bolt just with fingers and no longer with the ratchet, because there's now no longer any weight pulling against it, and the weight is now fully supported from the engine crane. Once these bolts have been removed from both sides, the engine is free to drop down, and obviously we just lower it carefully with the engine crane. Be aware that that the engine or any parts of the engine are not catching up on anything, and again double check for that last hose or that last electrical connector that hasn't been undone, and you will find that lots of things seem to catch up as you go. A little trick that I do is, as I'm lowering it, I always just kind of shake it and wobble it a bit and just make sure and just feel for the fact that it's not getting caught up as I begin to lower it down. You can see here the engine is just starting to lower straight down. If you had the radiator in place, technically that engine can still lower down with that radiator there, just makes it a little bit tighter at the front. I've found that those 2 points that I use, those engine mount points and transmission points, make the transmission and engine assembly fairly balanced when I'm dropping it down. Notice also that I actually took the throttle body off. It wasn't on the video, but I did take it off because I found that my chain was just going a little bit too close to it and was just putting a little bit of pressure on it, and I didn't want it to break. I can't stress enough, as you continue to lower the engine down, just to keep watching, make sure that it's not getting caught up on anything, make sure any hoses aren't being strained, and make sure that it just falls clear without any further damage to components. You will see, if you're watching closely, that I actually pulled the power steering pump off mine. Don't quite know what I was thinking when I did that. The power steering pump comes out with the engine and the steering rack and everything together. I think I was trying to do something else, but that certainly didn't work out, so I haven't videoed myself removing that, but you can see here that the pump has been removed, and I just had to install it on later on. But the engine and the pump and the steering rack all come out together as one big assembly sitting in the front subframe. As the engine, transmission and front subframe lower down, I find mine sits quite nicely on the wheels and the frame of my engine hoist, which is really quite convenient because I'm going to use that to wheel the engine out. I've had to jack the car up just a little bit higher here just to get the clearance I need to slide that engine and the assembly out from underneath the car. You could have something else if you want to sit on the ground, maybe some sort of a roller board or something like that. If you come out that front left-hand corner, particularly with the bumper bar gone, there's quite a bit of space there. It just has to move some of the plastics out of the way, and this is a very heavy front assembly, so it may need a second person just to help move it out of the way. I just wriggled it and manhandled it, and on the wheels of my engine hoist it sits quite nicely, and it's quite easy just to pull it out of the way. Just make sure again that no cables or wiring or anything has been caught up, because you don't want to cause any more damage as you remove the engine. You can see here it's just rubbing up against those plastics from up underneath the guard, but those plastics can just bend out of the way and you can just slide that engine through. It's quite a large assembly, so make sure you have plenty of room in your garage or your workshop just to put it aside so you can begin then working on the engine as you need. I did this work in a home garage, so if you're in a home garage as well or a workshop, it's quite a doable process. This only took about 2 to 3 hours for me to do, and that's why I was filming some of it, which does slow things down. A good set of hand tools would be really important, and I had a complete assembly just to literally slide back in underneath that car and put back in, so the car was back on its wheels and driving that day. Hey, now thanks for watching the video right to the very end. If you like what you've seen, make sure you subscribe, give it the thumbs up, leave a comment or a question below, and I'll be sure to answer it. Thanks for watching.